everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us today for Towards a Just Transition for All, a panel discussion on the future of renewable energy in Canada and beyond. My name is Mittertreiner, and I use they, them pronouns, and I'll be moderating the panel today along with Rachel Cheang and Dr. Jess Dempsey. I'm speaking today from the stolen ancestral homelands of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, where the UBC Vancouver campus is also situated. Rachel and I coordinate a student-directed seminar hosted with UBC's Art Studies Department titled Exploring the Intersections of Climate Justice. Dr. Dempsey of the Geography Department is our faculty sponsor. So student-directed seminars are accredited courses that allow students like us to organize semester-long classes on topics that aren't currently offered at UBC. And so we're a small class of 11 students from a wide range of disciplines, and we come together every week to explore a diverse set of narratives, perspectives, and challenges within the realm of climate justice. We acknowledge that this course is only made possible by our university's ongoing occupation of stolen Musqueam homelands. And as such, our goal as coordinators is to intentionally and very thoughtfully center Indigenous sovereignty and decolonial narratives in all of our seminar activities. This is a thread that we hope will be woven throughout all of our conversations today. And we also want to thank the UBC Department of Geography's Climate Action Committee, who have graciously partnered with us in hosting this panel so that we can make it accessible to all interested community members beyond just our seminar. We also have Dr. Dempsey's Geography 313 class, which focuses on environmental justice, joining us.
Thanks, Em. So our panel today has been tasked with the broad question of how do we achieve a just transition for all, allowing each of our panel speakers to draw on their various perspectives, research, disciplines, and experiences working in either the public or private sector or within grassroots initiatives. The Climate Justice Alliance defines a just transition as a principle, a process, and a practice that builds economic and political power to shift from an extractive economy to a regenerative one. The transition itself must be just and equitable, redressing past harms and creating new relationships of power for a future that leaves no one behind. In order to achieve a just transition for all, that includes marginalized, racialized, and Indigenous communities that are the most vulnerable to impacts of climate change, as well as fossil fuel workers and communities. And so today, we're very lucky to have with us Sandeep Pai, journalist, researcher, author, and PhD candidate at the UBC Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability, Shakti Ramkumar, UBC Geography alumni and Director of Communications and Policy at Student Energy, Mihskakwan James Harper, mechanical engineer and renewable energy scholar, and last but not least, Seth Klein, founding British Columbia Director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, public policy researcher, and author of a recently released book titled A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. And so we'll start off today by listening to short presentations from each speaker addressing the scale and scope of the energy transition and introducing their work within the field. We'll then shift to a moderated Q&A with some questions brainstormed by our seminar participants, and then take a 10 minutes break, and then regroup for a public Q&A where we'll be taking a few questions from audience members. And so throughout the event, you are invited to submit questions to specific speakers or the whole panel through the Q&A function, or click on the thumbs up icon on questions that other people have submitted to upvote ones that you would like to see being asked. And we'll be most likely picking the top 2 to 3 questions with the most votes. Throughout the event, do feel free to engage through the Zoom chat as well, and this event will be recorded and posted on the Department of Geography's website and YouTube channel. So without further ado, Jess, we will pass our time on to you.
Thank you, Em and Rachel, and hi everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We thought it would be important to start this panel with just very briefly giving it a primer on the extent of the challenge ahead of the challenge we face in terms of transitioning off fossil fuels. So we're going to show a quick 2-minute video. Aaron, if you could do that. Aaron is our awesome tech guy. So we're going to watch this video, which is from the production. It summarizes the findings of the 2020 Production Gap report. And the Production Gap project is a collaboration between the United Nations Environment Project and other sort of high-profile international research groups. And they study what governments are doing to wind down fossil fuel production to meet the 1.5 degree target. So, Aaron, please, it's very short. So as this video clearly shows, governments are planning to produce more fossil fuels, not reduce them in line with the Paris Agreement targets. And it also mentioned in the report, just if you want to like make your blood boil a little more, that while the pandemic caused a decrease in fossil fuel use, you may have heard this, subsidies to the fossil fuel sector have actually increased. There's a recent International Institute on Sustainable Development report that draws from data produced by Energy Tracker that found that G20 governments have given at least 233 billion US dollars in additional support through recovery measures to fossil fuel intensive sectors since the pandemic began. And this is also the case in Canada. So what I'm going to do now is I am going to pass it to Sandeep and the other panelists, and each is going to provide a short introduction to their work related to a just transition. And Sandeep has kindly agreed to first lay some foundations for us all related to the energy transition, the kind of scale and scope of what is necessary, giving more sort of grist than that production gap report. So please, Sandeep. Start things off.
Thanks, Jess, and thank you to Rachel and Em also. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. I hope you can see the screen.
Yep, looks great.
Okay, great. So this is going to be really short, but I thought like there are some foundational things that is good to know before we think about sort of like what is energy transition and just transition. So kind of thinking about those processes. So first, I mean, like the production gap report, this monumental report that came out in 2018 sort of really made it clear that if we want to, hit that 1.5 degree target, I think global emissions need to become net zero by 2050. What that really means is, in practical terms, fossil fuels like coal needs to be completely phased out. I mean, there's controversy around CCS and stuff, but for many pathways, coal needs to be completely phased out, and there should be massive reductions in oil and gas. So this is a huge change in energy system, right? So if you think about one example, let's just focus on coal. Right now, there are about 2,000 gigawatts of coal-fired power plants around the world. So if we need to phase out by 2050, on an average, roughly about sort of like 65 gigawatts of coal power should be retired every year. Now, this is a huge challenge. To give context, Canada's installed capacity from all sources is 135 gigawatts. So you're talking about sort of like, contracting or, declining or phasing out massive power systems. And at the same time, coal is used in steel and cement and various other industrial processes. And so coal use needs to also decline in those sources. The challenge is that most of the coal plants are right now in Asia, and they are young power plants. I mean, if you think about India and China, like most of their power plants have been built in the last 2 decades. So they haven't even reached the, they haven't even paid off their capex and things like that. So it's a huge challenge of how you phase out these systems and you do it in a way that these countries' economic development doesn't get affected. But there is obviously really good news as well. I mean, it is a fact that globally massive investments are happening in this renewable solar and wind space, particularly the solar sector. There is a huge technological push, innovation. The learning curves are sort of like really driving many of the technologies. Many countries, smaller countries, are sort of now using 100% renewable energy, and costs of solar and wind have just completely, gone down. And like, I mean, in many cases, they are cost competitive, at least in terms of levelized cost compared to, traditional thermal sources. So this is good news. But so the way I think about sort of like energy transition challenge, I categorize them into 2 categories. One being what is more called like the techno-economic hurdles. How do you manage storage technologies? Can you bring down the cost of storage technologies? How do you manage a grid? And then, how do you produce steel, cement? Can you use hydrogen, et cetera, et cetera? So those kinds of techno-economic, very technology focused, but cost focused ways to, manage this transition. Uh, the second, I think, is also super critical, which is, I think, the socio-political hurdles. Why are countries not taking climate action? And so there are many. I mean, it depends on this socio-political context. Political hurdles will depend on the context of different countries, but by and large, we see, at least in North America and Western Europe, we see a massive fossil fuel industry pushback. Not so much in other parts of the world because of the nature of these industries. It's state-owned enterprises, it's not private capital, et cetera, et cetera. The second is, like, obviously there is always this justification that we need to continue these industries because they provide jobs, they provide revenues, et cetera, et cetera. And the final thing in this is that in some instances we have also seen that issues like energy prices and energy security, et cetera, also play a role in terms of creating these socio political hurdles that countries are sort of not taking bold climate action that is required to meet the 1.5 or even 2-degree climate targets. Uh, so within this, broad framing of techno-economic or socio-political framing, my PhD, I mean, you have to choose one topic and sail with it. So I chose the topic of just transition, and specifically looking at, what happens to livelihoods of millions of fossil fuel workers, their communities, and dependent regions as we move away from fossil fuels. So that is sort of the broad framing of my entire PhD. And this is important because, of course, this is justice. As Jess and others were saying, this is a justice question. This is a question of you don't want to leave people behind as you move to new systems. And so this is also a concept now which is endorsed by, from ILO to UNFCCC to World Bank to every major organization. You will really find this just transition framing. Of course, different groups have different motivations. For some, just transition may mean like a transformation of the world. For others, it's a very narrow and specific focus on even from fossil fuel workers to fossil fuel regions and so on. So there are lots of different motivations, but broadly, just transition as a principle is adopted by national and international organizations and unions as well. Now, there is also a practical aspect of why I think it's an important topic. This speaks to the socio-political hurdle that I talked about, because it's, at least in democracies, or even in China, there is now evidence, but at least in democracies, we see that this has sort of become a partisan divide kind of topic where, one set of politicians support the continuation of these industries. And one of the legitimizing factors they use is that we will bring back those jobs, or we will continue those jobs, even though we know that the future of these industries are completely uncertain, and they're going to go away. It's a question of how fast we can do it. This phenomenon, like I said, is not only in the US, which we clearly saw, of course, in Canada, but in Australia, and in many other parts of the world. In fact, Australian Prime Minister, now Prime Minister, then Deputy Prime Minister, once had brought a lump of coal in the parliament and called his opposition coalophobic, because saying that they'll take away the jobs of men and women and so on. So this is really, from a practical point of view, this is an important counterpoint to those who support the continuation of these industries. And there is a lot of policy action happening on this topic. Many countries around the world are forming just transition task forces. They're formulating policies to support fossil fuel regions, the communities, the workers, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a very much public policy kind of topic with a very large global relevance. Wherever there is fossil fuel industries, wherever they will decline, this is going to be a topic. So just showing the scale of what it means. So within this context, I did multiple, obviously, like independent projects, but I will just quickly highlight a couple, some things which I think as a geography, like a student cohort cohort will really appreciate. So one is that we did like a global analysis of this just transition literature, and we came up with, what are some of the key principles or elements that are important. I'm happy to go into the details of all these elements if those come up in question and answer. But essentially, most studies say that we need a long-term planning. We need to plan even before the actual decline of these industries start, and so on. So that's one project that I did. The second was I collected this large data set of employment factors, which is like, how many jobs are involved in oil extraction or coal mining or coal power plants, etc. And then we use one of the IPCC integrated assessment models, and then we projected the job numbers for future. And I mean, the question was simple. If we take global climate action to meet 1.5-degree target, what happens to energy sector jobs? And so very, very briefly, we see that across scenarios, it seems that if we take bold climate action, the number of jobs is going to increase in both the reference scenario where the countries take the current NDC trajectory, or if we meet the well below 2C target. But the essential question, and I think Seth has also worked on this kind of topic, is that while it's clear from many studies that there will be more jobs if we take bold climate action. The question is, can you actually create some of those renewable jobs? It's one thing to have many jobs, but can you actually create those jobs locally? So one of my projects looked at whether can you create local solar and wind jobs, and I focused on China, India, US, and Australia because and focused on the coal mining sector, and these 4 countries represent 75% of global coal production. So what I did is I basically mapped the solar and wind resources around each coal mines and each coal mine in each of these 4 countries. And then I did like a techno-economic analysis to understand if from an economic and technology point of view, if it makes sense, if it's cost-wise feasible to install solar and wind power plants and create those local jobs. And I also estimate what is the kind of capacity you're talking about that you need if you want to transition all the workers in all these regions. And of course, I did it for all these 4 countries. And the results are very, very interesting. I find that solar has a lot of potential across countries, but not so much in China. So that except China, solar, you're looking at column 3. So you can see that only 29% of mines in China are suitable, areas around the mines is suitable for solar. But US is almost 2/3, and India and Australia, very sunny countries, have almost, you can transition a lot of workers around where they currently live and work. And finally, that wind is really a poor resource. In fact, there's a complete mismatch between where coal mining happens today and where the wind potential is. So practically what this means is that while renewable jobs, which always everybody sort of symbolizes as an option for fossil fuel communities, workers, may not be the option always and everywhere. It may be an option in some jurisdictions, in some places, but not everywhere. Of course, this only looks at generation. There are other kinds of renewable jobs and stuff. But I just wanted to give you a flavor of the kind of work I have done. I have other chapters which I can also talk about if it comes up. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to the question.
Thank you, Sandeep. Extremely geographical bit of research there. So I'm going to pass it now to Shakti. Please, Shakti.
Thanks, everyone. I'm so excited to join you today. And thank you, Sandeep, for that wonderful introduction. I think it really set the stage for our conversation. My name is Shakti. I'm the Director of Communications and Policy at Student Energy. And Student Energy is a global youth-led organization empowering the next generation of leaders who will accelerate the transition to a sustainable and equitable energy future. And we were actually founded by young people in 2009 in Calgary, Alberta, but now we work globally with a network of 50,000 young people in over 120 countries. And we have 47 chapters in 26 countries, and we offer a suite of energy education and skill building programs. And on that note, what I want to talk to you about today is why I believe young people might hold the key in enabling the just transition to take place at the pace that we need it to. It's pretty clear that we need to get hundreds of thousands of young people, particularly those who are already advocating for climate justice, into the energy space to see themselves as part of the energy transition. And this is often easier said than done, because globally from our network, we found that energy education and training is so far behind what we actually need, especially if we want these opportunities to be available to young Indigenous people, young Black people, people of color, people outside of the formal education system, all of those young people with identities from communities who have been excluded from the energy sector historically. And while I think we know that the fossil fuel industry is notoriously inequitable, one thing I don't want to overlook in the conversation on a just transition is that currently the clean energy space also remains quite a privileged space. We've heard from our chapters, from our program participants, that the pathway into actually being part of the just transition within the energy sector is not a straightforward one, especially for young people who aren't from privileged backgrounds, who don't have the right connections and networks to kind of get their foot in the door. And I've left a few stats up there from a US perspective, but I think what it all shows that to not let these disparities persist, we have a lot of work to do and a long way to go. And also to reconcile with the fact that the fossil fuel industry has spent years and millions of dollars getting into university curricula, into high schools, recruiting young people from a very young age. To kind of counter that and reorient our entire education system is a massive undertaking that I think will be an important focus of the just transition. And this is something we're actively working on at Student Energy, and we offer free, globally accessible energy education and skill building programs. And we hope that this will be the first step for many young people who may not have seen themselves in the energy transition to kind of get into this space. But we also know that young people, you can equip them with all the skills they need, but if young people don't have the right platform, enough resources, and access to decision-making power, it will be very hard to make an impact. And so we want to make sure we're bridging this gap as well, that we're doing the capacity building, but also opening up real pathways to decision-making power. And one of the ways we're bridging this gap that I wanted to talk to you all about today is through the Global Youth Energy Outlook. So the Global Youth Energy Outlook is a big youth-led research project that we're doing. It's the first report of its kind, and it will outline what young people want to see in their region's energy future leading up to 2030 and how they want to influence the energy industry. I think what Sandeep's presentation made really clear is that this will not be a one-size-fits-all solution in the just transition, and it's very important to have regional perspectives on the energy transition. And we hope that by doing a global report, it will give young people a broad base of support and community to work together, but while maintaining these regional focuses so that we can dive into the differences between each region. The project is entirely youth-led, and we're hoping to launch it at COP26 in November, the UN Climate Change Conference. And if you're between 18 to 30, I would like to invite you all to participate in the project. It's still ongoing. So we're building the Outlook in a two-phase research process. And the first is a questionnaire targeted towards people between 18 to 30 to really unpack what are your priorities and concerns for the energy transition in your region, and how do you want to work with governments and industry to kind of make this transition happen. And the second part of the Outlook research process is a series of in-depth regional dialogues to dive more deeply into the nuanced cross-sectoral energy topics that kind of emerge as a focus for each region. The final note that I want to leave you with is really why we're doing this. And the reason we're doing the Outlook is we hope that it will act as a data-backed advocacy tool so that young people can use this report and take it to their local, regional, national governments, and that it can serve as a catalyst for collective action on energy. At the same time, we are actively building networks with governments, with companies, with the aim that they use the Outlook as a framework to work with young people in a meaningful and equitable way. I think there's a lot of talk in the energy space right now about how inspiring young people are, how important the youth climate movement is, but these nice words are meaningless unless it results in real pathways for youths to have decision-making power and real resources and funds mobilized to support young people's work. So we hope that the Outlook will act as a powerful data-backed tool on both fronts. So I hope you check out the questionnaire. Thank you so much.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, and Rachel, just thank you so much, Shakti. Such great work, so inspiring. And Rachel just put the info in the chat. So fantastic. Okay, we're gonna move on to James now, who I believe also has some slides to show. Fantastic. Here we are. James, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Let me just get my slides here going. All right, I hope everybody can see this. Yes, thumbs up. Thumbs up. All right. So
Yep.
Tanse everyone. My name is Mihskakwan James Harper, and I am from Sturgeon Lake Cree Nation in Treaty 8 territory. But I am joining you from Treaty 1 territory here in Winnipeg, Manitoba, home of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, Ojibwe, and the Dakota, and the homelands of the Métis Nation. Proud to spare a few moments with y'all on what I'm up to and sort of the lessons that I'm uncovering during these unprecedented times, and sharing with you a bit of a different perspective, but one that is totally in line with Shakti's messaging of young people getting into action, and also Sandeep's messaging of, you know, the need to act now to meet those climate targets. So just going into it further, and please excuse me if there's anybody in the crowd who is a Cree speaker. I'm still trying to learn, and so one of my personal things is just to introduce Cree language words in various presentations and so forth. So Nikik means my home. And so you can see here, I make sure that even though I'm an urban Nihiao person, born and raised pretty much, you know, Edmonton and Winnipeg, I make sure that I visit my territory and reconnect with that relationship with the earth, with the land. And this is something that will underpin the entire introduction here. I just wanted to also say that I am completing a master's in renewable energy. That was done abroad, just in time, I suppose. Came back in a rush last spring, but I did complete and graduate. I also have a bachelor's of science in mechanical engineering. And one of the things I will talk to you about is 7Gen. I am a 7Gen council member, and we're just organizing an Indigenous Youth Mentorship Program along with an Indigenous Youth Climate Action Summit, whenever that is, when it's safe. But more importantly, taking an active role in doing what I can with the gifts and talents and the experiences that I was given to progress on the climate movement. So one thing I wanted to talk more about was about climate justice and what it looks like right now, climate injustice. I put this word Oka Wima Waski, which means Mother Earth. And that's because our relationship with the earth, with the land, is currently out of balance. And I think through everybody speaking and through the other panelists, I'm sure that we can all agree that there needs to be a massive reshift into what our relationship is with the land. Climate change has been observed by my relatives who still to this day around Sturgeon Lake and Treaty 8 territory hunt, fish, trap, you know, get out on the land as much as they can, picking medicine. Here you can see me picking sweetgrass. And one of the things that is so interesting that I'm only uncovering as of recently is that colonization, this country has had a very, very troubled and dark past with colonization that has devastated the lives and livelihoods of Indigenous people. And one can say that, residential schools, they closed down 1997. There's not so many forceful assimilative policies anymore. But what now is in front of us as Indigenous people is climate change. And that is because, and just backing up, it has the same, if not even more of a profound impact and effect on us because of the intimate relationship that we have with the land for our lives and livelihood. And climate change has a direct and indirect impact on our lives and livelihood. I mean, most importantly, I shouldn't say most importantly, most obviously, the changes to the land can change the wildlife and fish distribution, which can impact food sovereignty, which is a compounding problem, a problem of feedback, especially in the high north, where food prices, which are not found locally, are very, very high. So in fact, climate change is further worsening food insecurity in the high Arctic, as one example. But even indirectly, man camps through oil and gas projects, especially in northern Alberta, have contributed towards the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people crisis, and that's yet another impact that climate change has had on our lives. Communities near Alberta oil sands, healthcare professionals have documented increased rates of cancers and other chronic diseases for our community members in those areas. And not to mention, the Wet'suwet'en protests, the land back movements, and so forth, violent persecution of land defenders by the Canadian state. So even when we are trying our best to defend our lives and livelihoods, we are punished for it. And so in a way, you can sense that I'm a little passionate about it because it almost feels like we're never winning. We do want that to keep our livelihoods and our traditions and our languages and everything. But it seems like the more we try, the more that there's a lot of force that prevents us from doing so. So in all, one of the things that has come to my attention, especially during the pandemic, is highlighting that the relationship with Mother Earth is strained, and we need to do our best, not just Indigenous people, but as a collective, in restoring that relationship, which will act as a pathway towards reconciliation as well, among other things. So this is where my research comes into play. If you can just, as I speak, you don't have to really pay attention to what I'm speaking, but just look at the diagram. The diagram really carefully illustrates policy investments, with public funds into three categories of infrastructure that have targeted initiatives, such as into healthcare, into local food initiatives, land-based education, and so forth. And those have corresponding outcomes when implemented in the right way, of course. And then those intended outcomes achieve very, very important international frameworks that Canada loves to say that we want to achieve and try to achieve, like the Paris Agreement, like the UN Convention on the Rights of a Child. There's all these things that the Canadian state loves to boast about trying to achieve, yet we're not. But here is one mechanism or one sort of way of looking at what we can do to invest into infrastructure in Indigenous communities and for Indigenous people, to empower Indigenous people to have sovereignty over their own education, their own land conservation, things like this. And they could actually amount to meaningful climate action. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit more passionate as I speak, but in a way, we are stewards of the earth, and we always have been, and we always will be. And so the sooner that Indigenous people are empowered in these various ways, the sooner that we can achieve the 2-degree target, among other things, of course. So my more further into my research is about clean microgrid development in remote communities. Here you can see a fabulous photoshopped picture of me in front of a wind turbine, holding up the thesis that I presented in December. And in the chart below, you can see part of the analysis that I did in balancing a microgrid energy profile, where you can see the wind, the storage, and the solar, and the diesel. Of course, we're trying to minimize the diesel, but this is just one way to get off of diesel. But clean microgrids serving as four pillars of great community empowerment through climate action leadership, local pollution reduction, improved energy security, and economic development for the people, among other benefits, of course. So this is the work that I'm doing with Enerstore right now as a intern, and trying to get more communities that are currently reliant on diesel off of diesel with clean microgrids. So Oti Nikan means let's go forward looking, future looking. This is why I wake up and do the work, even though it's tough, even though the fight is difficult. I do it for the future generations, for my children, and for the earth. So thank you for listening. Hi, and I'm looking forward to the other panelists and the questions.
Oh, fantastic, James. That was wonderful. That slide with like those really concrete and detailed sort of infrastructural investments and the way that those can go to realize these international aspirations is fantastic. All right, I'm going to pass it over now to Seth. Seth, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Jess, and thanks for this invitation, and hello, everybody, and thanks for all of those fantastic talks. Yeah, so I am Seth Klein. I'm coming to you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, otherwise known as East Vancouver. As mentioned off the top, I spent 22 years with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, left a couple of years ago, and left to write a book, and a book that I hoped would tackle what do we do about this harrowing gap between what the science says we have to do and what our politics seems prepared to entertain. I very much agree with Sandeep that the principal barriers we face are socio-political and not technological. We got a few little things we have to figure out on the tech side, but it's largely ready to go. But the political barriers are more challenging. And I wanted to tackle that, and I had planned initially to write a single chapter on lessons from the Second World War as this example of rapid economic transformation. But as I delved into that research, I started to see more and more parallels. And not just with respect to economic transformation, but how public opinion is mobilized, and the role of inequality, and how we navigate confederation then and now, the role of Indigenous leadership then and now, young people then and now, civil society then and now, how to pay for it then and now, and perhaps of most relevance to this panel, what did we do for returning soldiers? And is there a model there for just transition today, particularly for those whose economic security currently derives from fossil fuel production? So that was basically the idea of the book. And here's the book, by the way. And my work, unlike Shakti's work and Sandeep's work, it's not international in the same way. It's a very Canadian book and rooted in a Canadian story. But that study out of World War II has definitely given me some interesting insights and lessons, one of which, of course, is the importance of leaving no one behind when you're asking people to engage in a great undertaking and to mobilize across society and across class, race, and gender. So I thought the first thing I would offer up in terms of the challenge of employment and just transition, to zero in particular on some of Sandeep's work. In Canada today, there's somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 Canadians who are directly employed in the fossil fuel sector. That's a lot of people. But I also agree with Sandeep that when we actually get serious about this task, on net, we're looking at more jobs. The challenge, as he's noted, is that it's not all the same jobs in the same places. And so we have to be deliberate about this. We've got to plan this. But to put that challenge in context, and this is the fun part of this little World War II study, that 200,000 to 300,000, that's a lot. But in the Second World War, Canada was a population of about 11 million people, so less than a third what it is today. Over 1 million people enlisted. And to Shakti's presentation, 70% of whom were under the age of 21. Another 1 million plus were directly employed in military production during the war. All of those people had to be recruited and trained up to do that work, and then a few short years later had to be reintegrated into a peacetime economy. And we planned that, and we were deliberate about that. And we created these audacious programs for income support and housing support and post-secondary training and apprenticeship programs that transformed the face of the post-secondary sector in Canada, largely doubled the size of the post-secondary education system in Canada out of those programs, and changed the lives of thousands of people. If we could do that then with that audacity, we can do it again, because actually the task today is less challenging than what we did at that time. The other piece of just transition, though, is a bit larger than just like the individual worker, and it also has a regional complexion in Canada. So overall, the Canadian economy is not highly reliant on the extraction and export of fossil fuels, but there are parts of the country that are, particularly Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland. And we have to recognize that those places have more heavy lifting to do. This job, this task is more challenging for them. And so one of the ideas I developed in the course of my research, and I've been trying to pitch, is that we need a new federal transfer program. I would call it a climate emergency just transition program. And it should be, again, big and audacious, something like $20 to $40 billion a year for the next 10 years, so that the promise of just transition won't be a hollow promise. People will see billions of dollars on the table. But the additional element I would add to it is that, unlike most federal transfers that just divvy the money up to the provinces based on their population, we would divvy the money up here based on GHG emissions. If Alberta is the source of 38% of Canada's GHG emissions, which it is, far more than their share of the population, they get 38% of the money. But here's the catch. We wouldn't send it to Jason Kenney because he's not to be trusted on this. Instead, we would create just transition agencies in each province, jointly governed by all levels of government, and importantly, by the Indigenous nations in those provinces, and put some labor and business people on the board and some climate experts so that they can decide together, based on the GHG profiles in each province, what makes sense in terms of climate infrastructure investment and training and apprenticeship programs, and so on. Another big economic institution I think that could help, and this comes back to one of Shakti's points, I think we need something like a youth climate corps, something specifically for young people right out of high school who want to take a couple of gap years in this small window of time that we have to do something dramatic and to contribute firsthand. And maybe that would then change the life course of careers people are choosing, and change the composition of the renewable energy sector, to speak to your point. And it should be big, something like, interestingly, what Biden has just proposed in his first few days with this Citizens Climate Corps, although I would give it a particular youth focus. And part of all of this should be a good jobs guarantee, something that advocates of the Green New Deal have talked about. At the broadest level, just transition, for me, is about making the connections between the climate challenge and inequality. There are, and that's what I think we're trying to capture when we say leave no one behind. There are these climate policy purists out there who say, don't link the climate challenge to social justice issues and inequality issues. You know, don't weigh it down. It's too it's complicated enough as it is. Don't make it more complicated. And I disagree with that view, both because inequality and climate are inherently connected. The richer you are, the higher your emissions. The poorer you are as a household or a community or a country, the more vulnerable you are to climate change, the more impacted you are by climate policies. But there's another reason why we need to link it, which is that that's how we win. When you think about the mobilization in the Second World War, you know, the enlistment numbers weren't very good to start off. It took time. And one of the things that had to change a couple years into the war, the government realized they couldn't just tell people, you know, on the basis of some theoretical threat, really, go, you know, sign up and go fight these people on the other side of the world. They realized they had to have a conversation with the public about the kind of society they would come back to. Canada's first major income support programs came in during the war. Unemployment insurance, 1940. The family allowance, 1944. The Marsh Commission, which laid the groundwork for the whole post-war welfare state, all the social programs we now are familiar with, was written during the war and offered up to Canadians as a pledge that the country they would come back to would look different than the one they were leaving behind. That's when you start getting the recruitment numbers. That's when you start seeing a true society-wide mobilization. And I think that has its echo in the appeal of the Green New Deal today. That when you link the climate fight with tackling inequality and leaving no one behind, and you put at the heart of it a promise of jobs and the good jobs guarantee, you sort of take that whole trope of jobs versus environment and throw it out the window, make it all about jobs. Then you see a level of support that is higher than the support we see for any political party. Its appeal is tremendous. And to one of Sandeep's earlier points, that's when, in the absence of doing that, we risk seeing climate action as a kind of elite exercise that's prepared to leave some people behind. But my last opening point would just be this. I think part of the message needs to be a change is going to come. It's coming. One way or another, it's coming. And really the only question before us is, are people going to experience that change through the tumult of the market, as many of them are now, in terms of oil prices and future demand? Or can we do this like we did in the war, in a planned and managed and deliberate way so that nobody is treated as expendable? All right, and I'll stop there.
That's great. Thank you, Seth. Lots of really excellent ideas going around here. So I believe now I'm passing it back to Em. Yes?
Thank you.
And Rachel? Yeah, go ahead.
So we're going to move on to the moderated question and answer portion. And in anticipation of the event, our student participants put together a few questions about our speakers' visions for a just transition more broadly. We'll have about 10 minutes for each of these 2 questions. And some of you have already touched on them briefly, but feel free to jump in as you feel called to. And so the first question is, centering the concept of a just transition for all, what do Canada and other countries need to do to reach the Paris Agreement goal? And what, in your opinion, are the biggest barriers to achieving just energy transitions? I'll also put that in the chat in case anyone missed it.
I mean, I can go very, very briefly. I mean, sort of the big picture thinking and just thinking about like, okay, what's the next step? I think the first step is not just Canada, but governments around the world are just building more fossil fuel infrastructure. That just has no place going forward. So that's number one, like no new built outs, like there's no economic sense even for developing countries. I study some countries like India, Vietnam very closely. Even in those countries which have recently built those infrastructure, there's no place for even one new coal power plant or an oil and gas rig. And so that that is pure inertia in many contexts. So that's number one. Number two, I think thinking more globally, I think OECD world has to first really start to phase out some of the existing infrastructure. I think they have outlived their years, and that needs to happen in a planned way. We must slowly move towards timelines. It's okay to just say net zero by 2030 or not 2030, nobody's saying that, sorry, 2050. But what does that really mean in terms of like, when are you actually shutting down? How do you plan? We still have 3 decades. So I think that is the second step. So no new infrastructure, planned phase out. And then within that, all the points that Seth, not within that, I mean, it's an interactive sort of thing. Within that, you have to think about just transition, climate justice, and how do you incorporate all that in the whole planning process, is my big picture comment on this question.
And I'd like to jump in on just what young people can do to kind of push for this urgent transition, because I think we're seeing a lot of momentum in the climate change movement towards climate justice, towards energy justice. And I think there are a lot more actors who don't get the scrutiny they should to be kind of pushed on this energy transition. One of the things we often talk about at Student Energy is what are the parts of the energy sector that climate activists aren't specifically targeting, that maybe if we lobbied in the right spaces, they would kind of facilitate the right conversations. And I think actors like utilities, regulators, policy makers in particularly regional and provincial governments, there's a lot of space for young people to build political power and push those actors to implement the right types of policies. And building that capacity, building the kind of peer support network is what Student Energy aims to do to kind of make that possible. So we hope to kind of arm the climate movement with the facts, the knowledge, the people who have the power to make small but significant decisions that will facilitate or hinder the energy transition. We hope to arm young people to kind of take that on and have an energy specific focus within the overall climate movement.
James, did you want to jump in, or do you?
Yeah, sure. I just want a quick one, ending fossil fuel subsidies and no more public investment in fossil fuel infrastructure. I cannot get over the fact that public dollars went into Keystone and into Trans Mountain, among others, while we're trying to suggest that Canada, we can meet our Paris agreements. Not to mention, where that money could have went in empowering the right people into a fair and sustainable economy. I could go on for days about that, but one of the things I also wanted to mention was Indigenous Protected Conservation Areas, IPCAs. And these areas are basically Indigenous owned and managed areas of land and crucial biodiversity that are legally protected. And Indigenous people have the authority, the legal right to assert their own conservation methods within these territories. And something like this has been done, is already being done in 2018 in the Northwest Territories, the Edezi, sorry, it's a Dene word, protected area. There's 3 more on the way as well. And establishing IPCAs is crucial, not just for protecting keystone species and protecting food security, but it also seeds conservation economies and language revitalization, land-based education, meaningful reconciliation. This is a pathway. If Indigenous people have legal jurisdiction over their own territories and conserve their own biodiversity, this is also a pathway towards meaningful reconciliation. I will just say also that for areas like wetlands and the boreal forest and other, carbon storing reservoirs, this just adds another benefit, another layer of importance for Indigenous people to conserve and protect these areas without persecution, by the way, for defending these areas as well. Yeah, that's just one of the many things that we need to also consider moving forward in terms of meaningful, just climate action.
So I'll just quickly weigh in on those two questions. In terms of what I think we need to do, these days I tend to talk about it in terms of if you know that a government is serious about an emergency, if they hit these 4 markers, okay? 1, it spends what it takes to win. Number 2, it creates new economic institutions to get the job done. Number 3, it moves from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures as necessary. And number 4, it tells the truth. It's forthright with the public about the severity of the crisis and what we have to do. Canada did all of those things in the Second World War. And interestingly, I would say our federal government has done all of those things in the pandemic. And with respect to the climate emergency, it doesn't just miss some of those markers. It hasn't hit a single one, and neither has any provincial government in our country. But those are the markers. In terms of why, the barriers that we face, I think, the curse of climate is that relative to the war, relative to the pandemic, it moves in slower motion. But that lets our politicians kick the can down the road too often. Secondly, I think our politicians falsely believe that the public isn't ready. And I say falsely because the opinion polling I've done actually reveals a public ahead of our politics in terms of seeing the severity of this and in terms of their willingness to embrace bold policies. Third, of course, is the nefarious activities of the fossil fuel industry itself, delaying, denying, discouraging actions, and a government that is captured often by that industry, and governments that still operate in a mode of seeking to appease that industry, to come up with climate plans that the industry can find comfort in, and the hour is too late for that. And the final thing I'd say is I think we're actually held back by the legacy of 40 years of neoliberal thinking that are like a straitjacket on our imagination and our sense of possibility. Why are governments not spending what they should? Why are they not creating new public institutions to get the job done? Why are they not just using the regulatory power of the state to require change? Because they accept these false assumptions from neoliberalism that these things aren't possible or allowed. And I think we have to cast those off. Interestingly, we've seen the government cast off all of those things in the pandemic, but not yet on climate.
Thanks so much, Seth. I just wanted to highlight your point about the public being ahead of the government, because I think for me and Rachel as divestment organizers at UBC, and also being mentored by Shakti, who was also involved in divestment, like we really saw how students and the public were pushing for divestment in a way that the university and the government aren't. And I think that is like sort of the whole point of the divestment movement, to be showing how the public is ready for this. And so, yeah, I think that's a really important point. Thank you. And I'll pass it off to Rachel.
Yeah, just to echo MI, I think the greatest thing about this panel too, and what I'm admirable about for all of you, is that you guys are doing the exact work to address these barriers and these challenges. And I think from what I'm hearing is that we need this huge shift of power and capital into the hands of local communities, of youth. And yeah, I think it's amazing just to hear your perspectives from all these different experiences that you have. Our second question is that given these barriers and challenges, what makes you feel hopeful about overcoming them in the work that you do? As students and as youth and future generations, I think something that when we talk about tackling the climate crisis is in centering hope and agency. And so we'd love to hear from you. We can maybe start with Seth, if you'd like to go first.
Sure, okay, reverse order. Well, so, I mean, just to remind ourselves, before the pandemic, momentum was really building. A few months before the pandemic lockdown, we saw the student-led stuff and youth-led stuff. It gives me huge hope. And we saw that youth-led protest in September before the pandemic of almost 1 million people on the streets in Canada, which, as near as I can tell, is the single largest day of protest in Canadian history. And a few months after that, we saw this wave of solidarity actions in support of the Wet'suwet'en, which I don't think anyone alive has ever seen before. And that was immensely hopeful. The other thing that gives me hope out of my study and research is that historical comparison, because for all of us who wonder, can we really do this with the speed and scale that's required? The answer is, yeah, we did, because we can do it because we've done it. The scale up at that time and what was accomplished in 6 years was unbelievable, and actually much greater than what we have to do today. But I would say this, the hope question's a challenging one. The truth is, we don't know if we're going to do this in time. We live in an ambiguous time, and that's the reality. We all wrestle with despair on this matter, any of us who look the science in the face. But just to finish with the point about the war, I mentioned before, out of 11 million people, 1 million plus of them enlisted in that fight. You know what they didn't know? They didn't know if they would win, and they did it anyway.
Yeah, and I just to add on to that, I really like Seth's analogy to tackling the climate crisis, or making parallels with the wartime measures that were in place to address this very thing that's in front of us. And one of the things I wanted to mention, and I'll segue into why I'm hopeful, is that Indigenous people in World War II and I, it was at the time a part of the Indian Act. You had to forfeit your Indian status to enlist into the war, and there were indeed quite a lot of Indigenous people, my own relatives, who fought in the war and who sacrificed their Indian status in order to protect and defend the lands, even though it was alongside and with the Canadian state. And just mind you, dropping the Indian status privileges of being formally recognized as a treaty person, for example, and having all the treaty rights to education and so forth, were lost because of doing so. So it demonstrates the amount of drive and amount of passion that Indigenous people have had and continue to this day through my work with 7Gen. And I see Indigenous youth, despite all of the adversities, despite all of the challenges, they are motivated and they are passionate about making and building their communities into something strong and resilient, and something that holds true that relationship with the land that makes them stewards of the earth and protecting of the children yet to come. So in that way, I'm very hopeful because, as Seth mentioned, and as Shakti also outlined, that our young people, especially who I work with, Indigenous young people, they're ready to get to work. They're ready to do it, and they're ready to defend and to put into the work in building stronger and more resilient communities.
That was beautifully said, James. And the only point I would add on what also makes me hopeful, in addition to everything Seth and James have said, is I'm finding it very hopeful that young people aren't buying into kind of novelty technological solutions that don't offer anything in the way of energy justice or climate justice. I think there's a certain sector of the climate action space, if you can call it that, that's like, whoa, this new technology is going to dim the sun, whoa. And from the youth around me, the young people that I work with all over the world, they're not settling for these kinds of solutions if there's not a significant and core focus on achieving multiple co-benefits for people, for nature, for ecosystems. And that gives me a lot of hope that so many young people, despite living in completely different energy contexts, completely different economic, academic contexts, are so on the same page on demanding kind of multi-sectoral wins in the energy transition.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have covered all the points that I was going to say, but I just want to reflect on my own experience. So in the last 10 years, since I've really started thinking about energy transitions, first as a reporter, now as an academic, I have really seen a shift in uh, like there is more societal pressure now than before, uh, not and across geographies, in terms of really taking climate action, which is not only techno-economic focus but also much broader, as Shakti was saying, and others, uh, which encapsulates sort of like, climate justice, environmental justice, and various other aspects. The second thing that makes me very hopeful is that I think now we are asking the right questions. We are pushing governments in many cases in the right directions. We're talking about solutions which are a win-win for all, because it's kind of, you have to reconcile with different groups. So the fact that we are talking about benefits of climate action, jobs, better environment and things like that, that gives me a lot of hope. Because instead of I mean, I think that is something that will resonate with locals across the world, as opposed to, the earlier framing that just let's just phase out all these things. But like, I think this benefit of what climate action will bring, both from a technology point of view, but from a justice point of view, is really, really positive for me. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks so much. I think we'll wrap up that part and go into the break now. We'll have a 5-minute break, and just a reminder that in the meantime, you can submit questions to specific speakers or to the whole panel through the question and answer function. And you can also click the thumbs up icon on questions that other people have submitted to upvote questions you'd like to see being asked. And so after the break, we'll probably pick the top 2 or 3 questions with most votes and ask those ones.
Welcome back, everybody. All right, so we're going to take these questions from the Q&A. Thanks to everybody who posted questions. We're probably not going to get to all of them, but we will do our best, and we'll definitely start with the ones that got a lot of thumbs up, as is the way, as is in the way of our time. So the first question, which I believe probably comes from a student in one of my classes, in my class, is, as we transition to renewable energy, how do we ensure we don't replicate the same colonial dynamics of resource extraction? And they're thinking particularly of lithium extraction in Bolivia. How do we uphold Indigenous rights in the renewable energy sector, thinking, beyond our borders? And this is because we listened to a really fantastic podcast, which I assigned in my class, which really raised a lot of these environmental justice issues around mining that are associated with the explosion in renewables. Sandeep, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. I think about this question all the time. So I think what's happening, and this is a really worrying trend, is that if you think about the energy system from a renewables point of view, there are 2 major challenges that I see that are emerging. Challenges, lots of justice issues around. One that was raised in the question itself about, in Bolivia, in the Atacama desert area, all the issues around water and mining and all that. And how do you extract rare metals? There's a bunch of reports recently that came out that talks about human rights issues in extraction of these different metals. And that, I think, is a growing challenge. And my worry is that the way things are going, while it's good for climate action from a pure emissions point of view, it may definitely create more inequalities. The second big challenge is, and this is a geography, again, a very geographical focused challenge, is that, and I know that this is not so much relevant for Canada, but in many parts of the world where land is an issue, renewables are taking up, all sorts of like farmland. So companies are acquiring, like from farmland to very like forest land and things like that. And that is also sort of a really worrying trend in terms of how this will play out. I don't have answers to that, but it's a very major challenge that one has to think about from now. That reminds me that there is also a third big thing that is happening. Like what's happening is that the way oil companies became so big is 5 or 10 years ago, there were a few companies and they were running, small operations. But I mean, there were many companies running smaller operations, but now more and more this acquisition is happening. And so these renewable companies are becoming larger and bigger. And they are in some ways becoming like the oil majors or coal majors going forward. That is also a trend that is really worrying because it will create same kind of inequalities and things like that. So it is a very major complex challenge of transition. I just don't have the answer, but beyond saying that we have to focus on this as well.
And I'd love to jump in.
Shakti, yes, please.
I don't have the answer, but perhaps an answer that I would just like to advocate for is a renewed focus on energy demand reduction and improved energy efficiency. It's our most overlooked energy solution. We are way behind in energy efficiency improvements globally. And this is, I think, one energy solution that could directly tie into the resource extraction and all of the injustice challenges related to that. There's a really interesting study that was done in, I believe it was in Nunatucket in Labrador, that found that actual community support for energy solutions was much higher for demand side measures like energy efficiency rather than supply side energy solutions. And one of the primary reasons was that supply side energy solutions do have the potential to perpetuate the extractive nature of resource development that our energy system currently relies on and that renewable energy might also rely on. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is that the experience of Indigenous communities and those living around and with resource extraction as part of their lives are the ones whose experiences we should really take into consideration in solving for this challenge. And the second report that I'd be happy to pop this in the chat as well was also just on the discourse about mining and resource extraction in general. I think mining companies have a lot to benefit by positioning themselves as like the key actors in the renewable energy transition. But there is a lot of greenwashing in the sector that I think it's important to take into account. There's a need to kind of disaggregate the metals that are closely tied to projected demand for renewables like cobalt, lithium, and nickel, and the ones that are mostly used in other sectors like copper and aluminum. And there's kind of a greenwashing tendency to meld this all together and say, well, the demand is going to be huge, it's inevitable, so we just need to deal with it. And that's really not the case. So I think that disaggregation and seeing through that greenwashing is very key. And then the last point that I want to leave on this is that I think another reason demand reduction is so important is that it allows us to focus on real solutions and really consider what are the services that energy is providing, not on the intermediary steps that kind of we take as for granted. Like there's a plan to put 1 billion electric vehicles on the road. That's not the only solution to mobility. We have energy access and public transit. So I think there's other ways to get to the energy transition that don't rely on endless growth.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah. On this topic, yeah, you don't have to ask me twice. And this is a great question, because even within the clean energy sphere, we have a lot of, like, I would say, traditional mentality, so to speak, or ignorant mentality that suggests that we should do clean energy at all costs, at any costs. Any social costs, because the urgency of 1.5 degree and 2050 targets and all of this. I do agree with aggressive need for climate action, but we should absolutely not bulldoze, the needs and rights of marginalized people, especially Indigenous people. So 3 main points I want to just mention is first, accountable and sustainable supply chains. I think after reviewing battery supply chains, we hear a lot about Tesla, we hear about a lot of the EV commotion that's happening. It's even particularly difficult for Tesla, this world-renowned manufacturer, very, very high end, to pinpoint exactly where their cobalt and lithium comes from. All the statements that we usually get is like, well, we try to not, but there's no way in knowing for sure that this, this pile of lithium versus that one over there came from unsustainable and discriminating sort of methods. Another point I wanted to mention is that we need to refocus, and this is what Shakti was touching on, was circular economies, not a endlessly growth extractive based economy. And this again comes into battery recycling and ease of material recovery. By design and from our manufacturers and with government oversight and regulation, we could see better, more positioned products and products within our energy system that are easy once they finally give out to reintroduce into new solutions. It's just a matter of trying to untangle that entire web again of very complex and globalized supply chains that we have now. And finally, rights-based and partnership-based approaches is key. And one thing I wanted to highlight from the last question as well, good news stories. My organization, Enerstore, a energy storage developer, just launched a 50-50 partnership with the 6 Nations of the Grand River Clean Energy Battery Energy Storage Park at 1,000 megawatt hours. If it was built today, it would be the largest in the world. And 50-50 partnership means that 6 nations, did that what they could do to get in with their investment, but also reap the benefits that the storage project will provide for 25 plus years. So with private investment and private sort of collaboration, a partnership-based approach and a rights-based approach where absolutely no rights of Indigenous people were violated in any shape, way, or form. In fact, Indigenous peoples were empowered to participate in this, means that we can certainly avoid this extractive colonial sort of mentality of energy and materials.
Wow, fantastic. James, if you get a chance, maybe even if you can dump in the chat the company that you work with, I think people will be interested. Thank you. Great, you all. Thank you for those answers. So I think I'm going to kind of pull together 2 questions. So this one on that you can all see about holding the fossil fuels sector accountable to help finance a transition, along perhaps if there's others on the panel that wanted to speak to the question about kind of climate reparations. And so I guess both of those questions really engage with the question of financing more broadly, but also a kind of like entwined with the sort of finance side, also asking for a kind of thoughts on accountability or reparations as a part of that approach. Anyone? Seth?
Well, it certainly needs to be sure. It certainly needs to be a piece of it that they need to ante up, and there's different ways of getting at that. I mean, one piece of it is just to James's earlier point, stop the subsidies. But there's various ways you could seek to capture some of what they have. I mean, at the very least, in our province, we charge these companies a ridiculously low royalty rate to extract this stuff. We should be, if we're in a wind down period, we should be capturing much more of it in partnership with First Nations, where they are keeping a large chunk of any revenues, so that can become an endowed fund for economic diversification once we're done with this stuff. I also think we should sue them, and you know, there is this push to get municipalities to do some of that, just to pay for some of the climate adaptation infrastructure that we're going to need. And I think there's a logic to that, right? These companies have known for decades, and that's the basis upon which there can be a suit. But you know, the truth is I don't hold out huge hope that we will be able to, at this late date, capture as much as we should have been all along before a bunch of these companies fly the coop, frankly. And so we're going to have to finance this in other ways as well. We're going to have to finance it through wealth taxes generally. You know, interestingly, the kind of profiteering we've seen in this pandemic was illegal in the Second World War. We had excess profits taxes that made it illegal. And we've also seen in the pandemic, you know, what's possible just from the Bank of Canada itself in terms of financing the transition before us. So there's no end of potential revenue sources to finance this thing, but the fossil fuel companies themselves should certainly be a piece of that.
Thank you, Seth. I realized I didn't let you weigh in on the lithium mining one. It's okay.
That's
if you
right.
Don't want to.
Well,
okay.
The answers were fantastic. I mean, just building on James's other point, I would just say, you know, one of the exciting things happening in Canada is that not only are Indigenous communities leading in blocking new fossil fuel infrastructure, but about 20% of the renewable projects in Canada are Indigenous led. That doesn't free us from the question, like we have to do this differently, and I think that's about embedding the UN Declaration in legislation at all levels of government, and as James said, doing this through a partnership approach. That won't be a sure and solid safeguard against what might happen, but it helps a lot.
Thank you. Okay, so going back to the accountability financing question, anyone want to jump in here? It's okay if you don't. Okay. Well, then I'm gonna put this question out there, and I think it's interesting, and I think it's this question about the dangers of a kind of state-fueled movement when systems created by the state are deeply racist and violent. So I think this question sort of comes from a place of questioning, I guess, a little bit about the state, since the state appears in like many, I think in particular, a lot of these conversations about these like massive investments in infrastructure. And so I think this sounds to me, this question is sort of like troubling that a little bit and looking for the panel to maybe shed any light on that question. It's not a straightforward
I feel like
one.
this question is particularly directed to me because I am ultimately proposing something that is very state-led, and knowing full well how fraught that is and what the historic track record has been on that. And yet here is the problem. With all of the amazing creative solutions out there and community responses and tech responses and so on, in the time we now have available, and the speed and scale with which we now need to achieve what we need to achieve, it will only be state-led or we're fried. So the answer isn't to run away from that. I think it's to go into it eyes wide open to that history and resolved together not to repeat the sins of the past. And we do learn from the past. You know, a lot of, so in my book, even though I'm lauding all of this stuff that happened in the Second World War, I have a few chapters on the cautionary tales the poisoning of indigenous territories during the war, the squashing of civil liberties, the internments, the shameful response to refugees. Why enumerate those? You enumerate those so that you go into this fight eyes wide open, committed not to repeat them. And we learn from them. You know, a lot of the worst atrocities in the Second World War happened under the War Measures Act. We don't have a War Measures Act anymore. Particularly on the urging of the National Association of Japanese Canadians, we scrapped it and replaced it with an Emergencies Act, which, unlike the War Measures Act, has certain safeguards around civil liberties and charter rights that didn't exist before. So slowly but surely, we get a bit better at this.
The other panelists, I don't know, James, if you have a thought on this.
Sure. I think this is where probably Seth and I diverge in thought. First of all, I don't want to discount perhaps the need for a strongly unified and coordinated climate action plan. You know, detailing out climate targets and passing on the information about what we need to do to the public and so forth. All of these things. I do think that there's great benefit to having a sort of single entity. Whether or not that's the Canadian state is another question. But I do agree that there's a lot of value in that coordinated approach, and globally speaking as well. But I will argue that especially for renewable energy projects, from what I've learned through clean microgrids, is that once it is community led and once it's community owned, there are so many benefits that remain within the community as well. And not to mention, you know, the pride and the immense joy that community citizens now feel about public infrastructure. I mean, when do people ever feel passionate about that? I can tell you that with the projects, you know, that we've been working on, community members within Indigenous nations are very passionate about telling and explaining to us their solar project, their wind turbines that are up. And furthermore, as I help develop more of these clean energy projects, it's so community dependent. People say like, oh, what's the solution for my community? Well, it depends. And that's a complete different mindset, or almost complete departure from fossil fuels, where it doesn't really depend. You can put a plant pretty much anywhere. But with renewables, we have to really be cautious. Do you have the wind resource? Do you have the solar resource? Taking into account all those assessments. And then, for Shakti's point, demand side management as well. Is there a way that we can build that in and make this community centered and focused? And I don't think that a completely state-led and championed climate action plan is really the route that we should go, just because, and I feel like for good reason, me and likely a lot of Indigenous people just feel hesitant about trusting the government on such a thing.
Can I just mention, those are all very good points and fair points. I don't view these things as totally either or. I think ideally they go hand in hand. And in particular, like when you think about Indigenous efforts to build renewables in British Columbia, or where you are in Manitoba, and something like Aki Energy and all, you know, this Indigenous social enterprise, they work best and they are scalable when done in partnership with a crown entity like Manitoba Hydro or BC Hydro, where the provincial utility can provide financing way cheaper than anyone can get on their own, and commits to buy anything extra, and can provide firm power when those renewables are intermittent. But you're absolutely right. The project should be community owned, and have that sense of ownership.
But and just again, sorry, I know we're going back and forth, but just to follow up on that, that's only if the utilities want, and that's only subject to the will of regulators and the utility. This is a common problem that has come up through my development work, is that, for example, Manitoba Hydro is not necessarily keen on having communities have their own generation assets. And if communities want to proceed, the rate at which Manitoba Hydro buys that electricity is not fair. It's too low to compensate for the investment that's needed. So I agree. In the perfect world, partnerships and with utilities and with the government and so forth would be great. But where Indigenous people are still held at the will, if they are nice and friendly and you call them on a good day, to do those things.
Yeah, we agree. The track record of Manitoba Hydro and BC Hydro suck on these things.
Em wanted to just jump in here to contextualize this question a little, because it came from the class that the student-directed seminar that Em is working with. Em.
Yeah, we had a few questions that were kind of around this, and I think some of them sort of drew parallels to the pandemic currently, and just the way that we're seeing a lot of different things happen between the state and the community in reaction to COVID. Some great and some not so great. And I think we've seen some really cool ways that the community has rallied together on this, different ways that the state has supported and not supported. And I'm just interested in, on behalf of my seminar participants also, like drawing parallels to COVID, if you guys have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'd also want to make sure Sandeep and Shakti get in on this question if you have thoughts, both in M and then more broadly this kind of question about the state.
So I love the fascinating, back and forth between Seth and James. I'm just taking this question more globally, right? Currently, our energy systems are run by governments. If you look more, zoom out of sort of Canada or North America, like 60% or 55% of oil is produced by state-owned companies. Over 60% or something like that. I mean, I may be off 5 or 10% here and there, but let's say half of our systems are currently owned by state-owned companies. The second question about and to James's point, thinking more globally, a lot of people have very few, like their emissions are quite low, and and this idea of microgrid is not really working well in many communities around the world. The reason being that the systems currently, the way it's designed, it is not even able to meet the basic needs. And there is this whole mentality that, it needs to be state run, large grids, etc., etc. So I think it's an interesting question. I do think that I echo both your points, and I do think we need a central planning agency. Form and shape is open to interpretation, because there is a fear that this will lead to more inequality. Some people will continue to live in darkness in other parts of the world. I'm not necessarily talking about Canada, but so it's important that we make sure that the whole process of renewable energy expansion does not lead to some people just sort of using low energy services, microgrid type low energy services, and some continue to enjoy the grid and so on. So just being cautious of that point is what I wanted to say. But great discussion.
I echo, everything James said and everything Sandeep just said as well. I think especially in the youth kind of energy climate movement, it's pretty hard to find anyone who's particularly motivated by allegiance to their state or any kind of nationalist project. So maybe in that sense, it's a question of messaging and communications. Maybe the state is not the one who should be at the forefront of kind of inspiring and being at the front of messaging on climate change. I think they've kind of lost that right, to be honest. But I agree with Sandeep that in questions of scale and in questions of distribution of energy access, the state has an important role to play, and that likely won't change in the near future. So my approach to kind of unpacking that for myself is to understand the state and utilities and regulators. And to James's great point, like that's yet another reason utilities and regulators need to withstand a lot more scrutiny and focus from the broader climate movement. They're not neutral players in this, is to understand them as levers that young people can use to take action, one of many. So they're not the solution, but they are certainly a solution, is state fueled plans and programs. And I think one thing I would like to add is the concept of just disparity isn't just between countries, but also within countries in terms of energy use, in terms of per capita carbon footprint, ecological footprint. And I think this will become a greater and greater challenge. What we hear from our youth network is they often have a lot more in common with young people in a similar socioeconomic situation in different countries than they do with the elite in their own countries. So reducing per capita ecological footprint, reducing per capita carbon footprint will become, I think, an increasingly important part of the energy transition. And I think the state could be a great mechanism to kind of force those elite to reduce their consumption. As Seth was mentioning earlier, going from voluntary to kind of mandatory reduction programs.
Thank you all for that exchange. Super interesting. I think we're going to wrap up with one final question, which kind of goes, bucks the trend of the likes. And it's this question by Guy, which I'm going to put in the chat for everyone to see. But really, it's asking the panel to kind of like thinking about this next decade and thinking about in the Canadian context, but you don't have to limit yourself to that either, of things that are going on, like Bill C-12 and the ongoing resistance against Coastal GasLink and TMX. From 2021 to 2030, what is the thing, which you can imagine, like the thing, that in the next year or two that really gets the ball rolling for the rest of the decade? So you got to say the thing that gets the ball rolling, the thing you want to see happen. Go. Anyone, jump in.
All right. Well, so he's flagged probably the most time sensitive. The C-12 thing is time sensitive because it's before the House right now. Although I think a number of people are so C-12 is the bill that would try to legislate clear dates by which the government has to achieve certain emission reductions. It's deeply flawed. The first date in it is 2030. So it needs to be amended. But the problem is the government isn't even bringing it back for second reading, probably because they don't even want to pass the damn thing before an election. Like, this is the trend we keep seeing, is dangling these promises and then saying, well, if you reelect us again, then we'll do it. Same with the Just Transition Act. So I think we need to keep pressing on those. But I just come back to my 4 markers. We need the government to put a substantial amount of money on the table in something like a just transition transfer and in infrastructure investments. I'm happiest if a lot of that ends up flowing to communities to do this stuff, but it has to be financed. And I think there are ways we start to communicate that this is serious. Like, I think we need a vehicle mandate that says you won't be able to buy fossil fuel vehicles as of 2025, that new buildings won't be able to tie into natural gas as of next year, that we ban fossil fuel advertising, right? If it's an emergency, why do we allow this stuff? We don't allow tobacco advertising. There's certain things that we can do that start to communicate that this is the real deal, the same way we have in the pandemic.
Great. Shakti, James, Sandeep. Do you want me to pick? Sandeep, great.
I mean, I think that's it. Like, I think I see governments around the world just not ready to commit. I mean, they're ready to commit to net zero by 2050 or 60 or whatever, but that is meaningless unless you are saying what it means the next year or the year after. It's just, I mean, it's just basically saying I'm not responsible. The next person in charge will have to deal with these targets. So uh, I just think that there is, like, coming back to my original point, that like there is no place for new fossil fuel infrastructure. And so if somebody is saying that we still need that infrastructure as transition support or whatever, energy security, I think in many contexts, majority, I would say, it's just a lie. I think it's just, so the first step is that any government has to come up with finance, very important, but also, short-term goals, like 1 year, 2 year goals, like ban this, ban that, no new power plants, etc., etc. Short of that is basically saying I will not deal with this. I'm going to pass it on to the next person, and then they deal with it. And then somebody else will come and then say 2060 net zero or whatever, right? So it doesn't really, yeah. So I think the short-term goal is stop expansion uh, of any fossil fuel and allied infrastructure, and then slowly, not slowly, but at the same time, talk about the end date. We need an end date to all this, which is both in the short term, but also in the long term.
That's great. A real emergency, not a fake one. Okay, Shakti or James? It's going to be a standoff.
I can jump in.
Okay, Shakti, please.
Well, I love that everybody gets to say one thing, because then it's like 4 things or 5 things, which is a much more comfortable list for me. I would say, just to kind of add something extra to what the panelists have already said, is I would really love to see a more of a focus and a connection between land and energy, on land use and energy, particularly with big shifts we need in food choices and food systems and land use. I think these are some of the biggest opportunities for emissions reductions, and we can't see that as a separate climate challenge that's apart from the energy transition. So I would love to see more of a cross-sectoral approach to tackling these interconnected challenges that ultimately all connect to our big goal of emissions reductions by whenever, 20, 30, 50, we need pathways to get there. So I would love to see more of a focus on land use and how that relates to the energy system and the movement for a energy transition.
That's
Great.
perfect.
James.
Yeah, I think everybody is touching on, for sure, investment in clean infrastructure. No doubt about it. We're spending over 82 billion and growing into the COVID-19 response, which we need to do. But this is demonstrating that the government does have the capacity to in an emergency, in a crisis, to act fast and swiftly in investing into clean microgrids and clean transport and so forth, and financing these projects. I will, on the topic of transport, since nobody mentioned yet, but I know that everybody's thinking about it too, I'll just put it in. We need a national plan to decarbonize our transport as well. I think it was mentioned by Seth or Sandeep about internal combustion engine vehicle ban within the decade, hopefully, because that's really, really essential, especially since Canada and the United States, for that matter, we've designed such a car-centric society. But moving into things even like high-speed rail, that's one way to decarbonize aviation. So looking at more innovative ways into that, and looking into long-haul freight decarbonization through hydrogen. I don't know what the solution will be, but looking into that seriously. But the final thing I want to add to is investment into natural infrastructure. And as I was mentioning before, these natural carbon reservoirs and sinks, and protecting our boreal forests and our wetlands, our marinescapes, everything in between that is also key, as to Shakti's point about food that's seen as, not a part of energy futures. It definitely is. Also involved are those natural carbon sinks and protecting them. And one of the best ways to do that is empower Indigenous people to have the legal jurisdiction over protecting and conserving those areas.
Fantastic. So great. What great way to leave everybody with these ideas. I'm going to pass it over to Em and Rachel to wrap up.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. I just want to say a huge thank you to the panelists, also the geography department and Erin for the tech, and especially Jess. She put so much time and energy into supporting students like Rachel and I in building spaces for learning, kind of like what Shakti talked about, having youth-led spaces for action. I've felt that the student-directed seminar has really been a space to do that, to explore things that we don't get to see in other classes. And I just want to mention that student-directed seminars are, there's more than just ours, there's several that you can join if you're a UBC student. So for any of the geography students here, that's definitely something that you should look into. There's tons, and they're on neurodiversity and fiction writing and horror stories and all kinds of things. But yeah, it's been a really great opportunity. And yeah, Rachel, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just want to echo that as well and say that I love the back and forth. I think the whole point about having panels like that is open conversations, and that's the center of education of universities and running such events. I think that if anything, that the biggest takeaway from today's panel is that we need solutions at every scale and scope, and that we need to center Indigenous sovereignty within them, and also highlights the need of more of such conversations and bold actions to build concrete plans moving forward. And so that's what I took away. I'm sure every other participant has taken away something new from today's panel. And so at the same time, on behalf of Jess, Em, and myself, expressing the utmost gratitude to all four of you and to all our participants for joining us today. So thank you all so much.
Thank you. Hi.
Bye all. Thank you.